I'm just going to say a bunch of words that we wouldn't normally say, but it's the only way I know to frame what we're discussing. And some of these expressions are going to be offensive to you in particular. What we're going to talk about is life, the Christian life after justification.
I love it.
Which should deregulate your nervous system when I say it. The Christian life after justification. That concept itself, I think, is wrong-headed. But in general, what we're talking about is what is popularly known in Christian circles in theology as sanctification, living the Christian life. We typically view it in a progressive way. There's a progress of sanctification. People listening might go, yeah, of course, we want to deconstruct that a little bit. Couple things before I turn you loose. Feel free to express yourself. And by the way, Nat, nice hat.
Thank you very much.
And to Miranda out there, no holes in the jeans. There's a meme out there with my last live with you. Me. When I think about how the Christian life, living the Christian life was defined for me early in my Christian walk, it essentially came down to this. The Christian life is mainly about not doing things, staying away from certain things, curbing certain behaviors. That's the definition of quote unquote sanctification, progress that came to me. Now, when I think about that, I more think God save us from a definition of Christianity that comes down to not doing things versus enjoying the freedom that we've been given in Christ. And that's a complex issue on one level, but a simple issue on another level, right? And as I'm thinking about sanctification, some of the things you've said recently since our last live, and this isn't a part 2 of that, but it does come from some of the discussion you've had with some pretty lively people in your social media world. Most people immediately equate sanctification with morality. We believe that's a mistake.
Yeah.
Because it is quite possible for anyone out there who has no connection to Christianity at all to look like a perfect Christian because of moral progress. We think that definition is faulty, and it sets the bar much lower than people expect. So the first question out of the gate for you, and none of this is planned. You have no idea what I'm going to ask you.
I do not.
You're in the batting cage, and I'm just sending them. Why is it faulty, and why is it wrong, and I would say even dangerous to equate the net effect of the Christian life with morality? Why? Why is that problematic?
Well, first of all, let me say that when talking about sanctification, there is, depending on who you're talking to, there is a progressive element to it, which I think is the secondary element. There is a positional element to it, which I think is the primary element. The word sanctified simply means set apart, made holy. God does that. God has set us apart. All of the holiness and all of the righteousness required from us to be in a relationship with God has already been given to us because of what Jesus has done on our behalf. So in that sense, we can say positionally, we are as righteous and as holy right now as we will ever be in this life. It is a positional sanctification connected to God's vertical work for us. If we want to talk about sanctification in any kind of progressive way, which is the dominant way it's spoken about in most Christian circles, most churches, it was the predominant view that I grew up hearing about, that sanctification is this synergistic, this cooperation with God by which we become better and better people. We become less sinful. I actually heard a well-known, now deceased preacher from Southern California. I was tagged on this post because someone wanted my thoughts on it. And he was explicit in describing sanctification as the process by which we will, over the course of our lives, sin less and less and less. And he reiterated that same point using that exact language 2 or 3 times. So there was no mistaking. He was not apologizing for that. It wasn't a flub up in his language. I mean, that's truly what he believes. And that is mirrored across the board in a lot of churches, a lot of religious and Christian circles, that even if they don't know the word sanctification, the belief or the understanding is that once you become a Christian, or once you get into religion, that the primary purpose is that you will become a better and better person. Now, that assumes some definitions about what it means to get better, which we can talk about in a few minutes. But I think it is, as you said, that view that sanctification is the lifelong process by which we increasingly get better, increasingly sin less, is not just wrong, in my opinion, unbiblical, but incredibly dangerous. It's enslaving. It sets us up to fail. And more importantly, in my opinion, it promotes a culture of pretending. I have to pretend to myself, and I have to pretend to my church, to my Christian friends, that I'm actually better than I am. My response to that clip that I was tagged on about sanctification being the process of sinning less and less and getting better and better is that you have to have a very shallow, very small, very behavioristic view of sin to come to that conclusion. When we talk about sin, we're not just talking about bad things that people do. We're talking about everything from things we should feel that we don't, things that we should do that we don't, thoughts, motives. I mean, when theologians talk about the doctrine of total depravity, they're not just talking about the fact that in and of ourselves we are unable to come to God because we're born dead in our trespasses and sins. That's applicable to someone before they become a Christian. But total depravity is applicable to people after they become Christians too, in a different sense. And what it posits is the idea that sin affects us in the totality of our being. Our mind is affected by sin. Our feelings are affected by sin. The motivational structure of our lives is affected by sin. Our bodies are affected by sin. There is no part of us that is sin-free in this life. None. So that even our best deeds, as Martin Luther said, there is something to be pardoned even in our best deeds. That even in what I would consider my most selfless acts of love, there are impure motives. I want something back. I want people to see me. There's something under the surface that is tainting even my best works, even my most selfless acts of love. So to come to any definition of sanctification that it involves sinning less and less forces the person saying that to conclude that sin is essentially a behavioristic problem, and that turns the Christian life into a behavior modification program. So now Christianity and the Christian life is all about getting better, improving, progressing further and further away from sinful tendencies. And that's just not true to reality. If anybody has even a smidgen of self-awareness, they would have to conclude that there is no part of them that is sin-free. And that even, and it gets worse, because for all of us, we get better in some ways over the course of our life, we get worse in others, but a lot of things pretty much stay the same over the course of our lives. We change and we grow and we move into different seasons of life, but the core tendencies that we have, the core appetites that we have, our core proclivities, a lot of that stuff is stuff we deal with for the rest of our lives, we battle against for the rest of our lives. And so this whole idea that in some ways we get better, I may be more patient now than I used to be. Part of that's because I'm older and more tired than I used to be, and has nothing to do whatsoever with moral fortitude. Gerhard Forde, a Lutheran theologian, once said in a book that he wrote that he thinks he lusts less than he used to, but that's just because he's too old and too tired to lust the way that he used to, not because he's more holy than he used to be. And that's just such realistic talk. So we get better in some ways, we get worse in others. I may grow in my patience over here, but grow in my impatience over here. But a lot of things pretty much stay the same. And to make matters even worse, when I become proud of the ways I've gotten better, it's actually a sign that I've gotten worse. And when I become aware of the ways that I've gotten worse, it's actually a sign that I'm getting better.
I read something last night that said any truly sanctified person would never point to the progress of their sanctification.
Ever. That was Forde also. Amazing. The greatest essay, by the way, for anybody who cares, ever written in the history of the church, in my very biased opinion, is an essay simply entitled Sanctification by Gerhard Forde, spelled Forde. He is a now deceased Lutheran theologian. He crushes it. He wrecked my paradigm. He's the one who said in that same essay that sanctification is the art of getting used to our justification.
Let me pose another question. You were criticized of mixing, confusing justification with sanctification, which is ironic because those that follow that moral arc of sanctification are always conflating justification, so pulling them together in one act. That's a different sort of conflating. In my mind, Forde, you, myself, who hold that definition, sanctification is the process of getting used to your justification. The two are distinct realities, but can you ferret out and define and expand your understanding of that expression? Because it's a very liberating expression. And the way that I used to say it to people to get them to understanding in a kind of a lightning strike moment is, if you're going to hold that moral arc definition of sanctification, the thing that you need to hear is that no matter how far you progress in that model, what you can't forget is that at any point on that timeline that you think you're getting better, you need justification by grace through faith to be saved right now, the way that you did when you first believed. Justification, the need for it never goes away. It's always the banner. But expand on what you think Forde was saying and how you've processed that in your own world when you say sanctification is the process of getting used to our justification. What do you mean by that?
So in the Calvinistic Reformed circles that I was trained in, nurtured by in many ways, no one ever said this explicitly, but it was strongly implied in the literature, the books we had to read, and in, the teachers that taught. It was implied that justification is step one. Sanctification is step two. That once we get to step two, we never need to revisit step one. So you could put it like this. The way I understood it, from the way it was taught, was justification is the good news that God monergistically It was God's blood, sweat, and tears alone that got us in. Now that we're in, we set that aside. Now the focus of the Christian faith becomes the life of the Christian. And what that looks like is this cooperative effort between God and me that requires my blood, sweat, and tears to keep God happy with me. As you said a minute ago, justification and sanctification are distinct but never separated, ever separated. That justification is the fuel for sanctification. And even when I say that, it can be misunderstood by moralists to mean, okay, I get it. Justification is the fuel of sanctification, which means that justification is the fuel for our moral betterment, for our behavior modification. And that's not what I'm talking about. If we want to talk about sanctification in any kind of progressive sense, I would rather talk about it like this. Sanctification is a growing awareness of our dire need for God's ongoing grace, period. In other words, sanctification is marked much more by honesty and self-awareness about your actual condition, rather than a moral altering of your condition that evidences itself in less and less sin. That is, like I said, something in the Bible. Now, there are passages in the Bible that people point to all the time that seem to imply that sanctification is this process where we're sinning less and getting better. But a much more careful look at those passages, exegetically, theologically, historically even, prove that sanctification, if we can speak about it in any kind of progressive sense, which, as I said a minute ago, is at best the secondary sense, not the primary sense. The primary sense, positionally, done deal, we already are sanctified right here, right now. If we want to talk about it in the secondary sense of progressive, then it would be much more a progression downward rather than a progression upward. So the Apostle Paul, when he's giving us his resume, his spiritual resume in Philippians, and he says, I was the best of the best when it came to the religionists. I kept the rules. I dotted my I's. I crossed my T's. I knew the law. I taught the law. I did everything by the book. And now that I know Jesus, none of that stuff matters. Like, it's all just, it's all resume padding. For what? It's unimpressive. And so in that sense, what he was saying was sanctification is not, I'm getting better and better and stronger each and every day. Sanctification, if it's spoken of in a progressive sense, is I'm becoming increasingly aware of how weak I am and how strong Jesus was and continues to be for me. So that's why the Apostle Paul, as we've talked about before, at the end of his life, having planted churches all over the world, wrote half the New Testament, more than half the New Testament, was able to say at the end of his life, I'm the worst guy that I know. I am the chief of sinners. I am the least of all the saints. In those statements, he is giving evidence to the fact that the sanctification for him has been an ongoing, growing awareness of his sinfulness and his deep gratitude and appreciation for God who forgives sins. We are always growing in grace in that regard. When the Apostle Paul says to the Galatians, when he uses the phrase fall from grace, we use it in our church culture about people who have done something really bad. They've had some moral failure. They fell from grace. That is the exact opposite of the way Paul uses it. What he's addressing in Galatians there are Christians who know that they were saved by grace, who are now trying to perfect themselves by law. And he looks at them and is like, you're an idiot. How stupid can you be? I mean, you've completely forgotten what gets you here and what sustains you from here on out. So when he speaks about falling from grace, he's talking about leaving justification behind to focus instead on my personal growth. And the way that personal growth happens is by adhering to the law. The law of God is good. We need it. Martin Luther referred to the law of God as a divinely sent Hercules that attacks and kills the monster of self-righteousness in us all. So when people call me an antinomian, which is a big fancy word for anti-law, and they call me an antinomian, I always chuckle because I think to myself, no, I believe in the ongoing work of God's law in the life of the Christian. I just don't believe that I'm getting better by my adherence to that law. I see the role of the law as exposing us constantly. When I start to get better and I start to become proud of the way I'm getting better, however I'm defining it, and I start comparing myself to other people and my self-righteousness is growing as a result, I need to hear Jesus' words afresh. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the standard. Anything short of perfection is failure. Max Lucado gives this great illustration in one of his books about the distance between Earth and the moon. And he says this is the way we typically evaluate ourselves and evaluate other people in church and religious circles. If God said, look, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to obey any rules. You don't have to do anything. You just have to jump from here to the moon and you can be saved. And he says, we say, okay, we'll give it a shot. Some people jump 6 inches. Some people jump 3 feet. Some people might even jump 9 feet. But compared to the hundreds of thousands of miles needed to get to the moon, what difference does it make? Who jumped 6 inches or who jumped, 6 feet, 9 feet? And his point was, God's law requires something we can't and can never achieve. It's what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, but I tell you. And what he was doing was elevating. He said, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. I'm not here to sweep the law under the rug. I'm here to fulfill it. It requires fulfillment in order for God's justice to be satisfied and his righteousness to be satisfied. And you guys can't do it. I've come to do it. Well, no, I could do it. Jesus goes, I got a sermon for you. Okay, you've heard it said that if you don't kill anybody, you're doing pretty well. But I tell you, if you've ever been angry at all or harbor a grudge against your brother, before God, you are a murderer. You've heard it said that if you don't commit adultery, you're doing fine. But I tell you, if you've ever had a lustful thought in your heart for a split second, you are an adulterer. In other words, he elevates what we thought the law required to something unattainable, unachievable. So the ongoing work of the law in the life of the Christian is a work of exposure, a work of humiliating us in the best possible sense so that we won't fall from grace, but rather fall back into it. So I'm all for talking about sanctification in a progressive sense if by what we mean is I am growing each and every day, more honest with myself and other people about what's really in my heart. And if I'm growing in my awareness of my need for grace so that I too can finish my life and go, I've met a lot of people. I've met a lot of good people, a lot of bad people, but there is no one that I know or who I have ever met who is worse than this guy.
Yeah, when I think about that moralistic system of that view of sanctification, I think about just how suffocating, how it pushes us away from honesty and reality and those sorts of things, that it's people sit in context in churches where it's impossible for them in their own minds to be honest about their own struggles. That leads them to sit in isolation in those struggles. I also believe the reason that people flock to that definition of it is that we still love the law. because it gives us something to measure, something that we can do. It's focused really on the individual and on the self. But that monergism that you mentioned applies there as well.
Yes.
It applies there in our sanctification in the same way. That also is a God-wrought event in us, the capacity to have self-awareness, to admit our weakness, to understand the power in admitting our weakness is something that's counterintuitive to us. And so we love that world because it's the old world of the law and transaction. And fundamentally, Tullian, we don't know what to do with nothing to do. It's like going on vacation. If you work all the time and you're very busy going on vacation, the first couple of days, you're antsy. You don't know what to do. When you fall into grace, there's going to be a tendency to want to do some things. And this is what scares people. This is why they go to that system. There's nothing to do.
Right.
With regard to your position before God, where you're going to end up and how God feels about you right now, nothing left to do.
Right. That's right.
And that fear that has produced this system is the fear of moral laxity.
Yes.
That's why these definitions were made so finely and such distinctions were made. One is God's part, one is our part, is because we're trying to get people
To behave better.
to behave better.
Yeah, that's...
And additionally, and this brings me around to the sanctuary and to us and to you. When I think about preachers, leaders of ministry, there's no one more afraid to be honest about themselves than the pastor, preacher. You very rarely ever hear honesty about themselves coming from the pulpit. And if you do hear honesty, somehow it ends up being some sort of accolade of their success. Anyway, what I hear around here, what I hear from you is a pretty bold honesty. And it has this trickle-down effect in our culture. My Lord, if he's that honest about his own struggles, if that's the definition of the Christian life, then I'm safe here. I can be honest about my weaknesses, about my struggles, the things that I spent so much energy hiding. I don't need to hide here. Why is it important for you, and people watching this will have seen you preach, they will have seen you confess your stuff in public. Every week it's this way. Why is that so important for you in terms of leadership and communication, and how does it tie into this definition?
Most of it's not strategic. Most of it is just an overflow of who I am. I have the ability to keep secrets. Everybody knows that. I know that. I will go to my grave with secrets that nobody knows about except God. I hope. But at the same time, honesty is such an attractive thing to me because there's so much freedom in it. So much freedom in it. And I've lived in seasons of my life where I have felt unfree, specifically in church settings or around Christian people or religious people, where I couldn't really be myself. I couldn't really tell the truth about myself for fear of rejection or judgment or criticism or whatever. Churches, as you've heard me say before, should be the safest place for fallen people to fall down and broken people to break things, but all too often, scandalously, it's the scariest place. And the reason it's the scariest place is because of what we're talking about. Cultures are formed around content. And when the content is, if you're a Christian, the way you will know it is if you look at your life and see that you're sinning less and less and less. If that's the message, implied or explicitly stated from the pulpit, it will inevitably create an unsafe place for people to be real, for people to talk about what's really going on in their lives, for people to actually tell the truth about themselves. It actually cuts against honesty, truth-telling. So we fake it, we pretend, we tell ourselves lies about ourselves that we can believe in front of other people. We see it as a survival tactic in order to have a better self-image or whatever. There are all sorts of tendencies and addictions and proclivities and thoughts and feelings and secrets that we have to ignore that's actually going on inside of us in order to play that game. I hate that game. Absolutely hate that game. I don't play that game well. I never really played that game well. And so even when I was a minister in good standing in my former life, I was considered a gadfly for this. And what's always interesting to me is that the critics will never respond to the existential point being made. They'll always respond to the existential point being made by throwing a Bible verse in there. And I've discovered that theology, Bible reading, Bible memorization can be an incredible place to spiritually escape from the reality of who you are. So I'll give you an example. I've preached sermons on the Ten Commandments before, and the point of those sermons is not that the Ten Commandments are a goal for us to achieve, but a wall we crash into so that we'll finally recognize our dire need for Jesus. Okay? They exist to expose us, primarily. And so that's the tactic that I take when I preach through the Ten Commandments. And inevitably, by week 2, week 3, week 4, not here, but in other places I've been, the questions will start coming in like, okay, you've just described our inability to do what God requires, to the degree that God requires it. And I get that. I get that's applicable for someone who's not a Christian. But once we become a Christian, we've been regenerated. Now we have the Holy Spirit inside of us, empowering us, enlightening us. Aren't Christians now able to increasingly keep the Ten Commandments? And my response is always, that's a very interesting discussion. It'd be fun to have that conversation, smoking a cigar, having a drink, talking theology, stimulating. It's not my primary interest. My primary interest is whether or not you can keep them, unimportant. The question is, are you keeping them? And that immediately forces the person to go, okay, so this isn't all about theology and ideas and doctrine. This is about honesty. Okay, so even if I am able to keep them, why aren't I? Why can't I? Why am I not keeping them the way that I ought? So forcing people to get honest is the first step in setting them free. I've said this a handful of times over the years, but the person who has the least fear telling the truth about themselves is the person who knows at a deep level just how much God loves them unconditionally. When justification is the focal point, God has made me right with God, God has adopted me, God loves me, there is no interruption in his love, nothing can separate me from God's love, regardless of how I act or what I do. God has made that certain. When that becomes the focal point, it's a daily reminder of how you are unable to separate yourself from God's love, which then sets you free to tell the truth about yourself. Because when I know that God loves me unconditionally, I don't need everybody else to like me as much. And when I don't need everybody else to like me as much or approve of me as much, I'm much more willing to tell the truth about myself. So I can tell you the truth about myself. And if you don't like me as a result of that, I may not be happy about that, but I'll be okay because God's love is ultimately the only love I need. When you know that your approval, that you're already approved by God, it's a done deal. Well, now I don't need everybody else's approval. When I don't need everybody else's approval, I'm much more free to tell the truth about myself, to be honest with myself and about myself, about what's really going on, about the real struggles. There's no way a culture like that can be created under this progressive sanctification paradigm that sees behavior modification as the end goal, sinning less is the end goal. That a culture of honesty cannot be created with that kind of messaging.
So a yes/no question for you. Culturally speaking, then, is honesty within a church culture, individual honesty, the collective honesty of that group, the primary indicator that grace is present and flourishing in that space?
Yes, I would add to that some other qualities that are interconnected with honesty. Freedom, laughter, never taking ourselves too seriously. My grandmother used to say, take God seriously, but never take yourself too seriously. And when you take God seriously at his word, I love you no matter what. I will never leave you, never forsake you, got you. No matter what you do, you can't do anything that will make me love you more. You can't do anything that'll make me love you less. When you take God seriously at that word, you don't take yourself too seriously. So there are other qualities. I think honesty, the way that I would say, if I were going to give it one word, a compound word, to describe the kind of thing, that the primary characteristic that a message focused on justification produces, it would be self-awareness, which is coincide with honesty. I'm getting honest about who I really am. I'm digging deep, and I'm not afraid to dig deep. I'm not afraid of what I'm going to find, because I know regardless of what I find down there, it doesn't alter the way God feels about me. That frees me to explore the caverns in my own life, the caverns of selfishness, the caverns of pride, the caverns of lust, the caverns of discontentedness, all the caverns that are down deep inside. What frees me to explore those caverns without fear is knowing that I'm good with God come hell or high water.
Excellent. One last thing, then we'll wrap it up. The staff was having a conversation about our culture, this culture we're describing, self-awareness, honesty, laughter. And you made an observation about an effect that this culture has in people with other people, which is missing in this other world. Thank God I'm no longer in it. And that feature, that trait in that culture is patience with people. What progressive sanctification lacks, because it's always on your heel, moral improvement, is patience with people. You should be here now. The culture that we describe and are describing, and that we quite frankly enjoy, text me, I'll give you the address, the Church and the Times for the service, is by nature and by a result of this emphasis very patient with people. It allows God, and you made this observation, you pointed it out, and it's actually true, to do the work in the person.
Right.
I'm not standing 10 paces of moral progress away waiting for them to get to where I am. They're on their journey with their understanding of grace and self-awareness in that space, but it creates this patience with people that is similar to, mimics God's grace with me, that I don't need them to be at any point on the line of moral progress for me to love them, accept them, which strangely and counterintuitively helps free them.
Without question. It's so much more freeing to understand a simple, fundamental truth, which is this: it is God's job to change people, and it's my job to love them. Simple, but incredibly difficult, because we're all fixers of ourselves, fixers of circumstances, fixers of other people. We all possess, since the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3, we all possess some measure of a God complex. All of us do. So my relationship to my kids, my 4 grandkids, my wife, my friends, people in my orbit, people in my world, has been simplified from fixing them, changing them, to simply loving them. And when you believe that it's God's job to change people and our job to love people, first of all, you can only believe that. The only way you can believe that so that it becomes practice is by believing the truth of justification and this particular view we're articulating about sanctification. Maybe somebody feeling bad about their particular sins, as grievous as those sins may be, is a more sanctified position than someone who is looking down on that person for those same grievous sins. So it's almost like, what is worse? The person who commits adultery or the person who looks down on the person who commits adultery? Well, they're both bad. What makes the person who looks down on the person who commits adultery even more dangerous is that sin operates much more deceptively in our goodness than in our badness. It lurks so much more deceptively so that we actually feel good about the fact that we're not like them. Sounds familiar? Those are the people that Jesus spent most of his time addressing. So what's ironic to me is that the very thing that these people are championing as it pertains to behavior modification, sinning less, strengthening moral fortitude, all that progress, whatever they want to say, is that they're actually getting worse in the ways that Jesus calls out the most. They're becoming more self-righteous, more prideful. And you hear it in the things that they say. They're becoming less self-aware. They're pretending more. They don't understand the truth about the depths of their condition. And so they don't admit the depths of their condition. They don't confess that stuff. All of those things. I've shared this story before, but I was sitting in a seminary classroom in my late 20s, and a big, well-known preacher came in as a guest lecturer, and he was the guy we all wanted to be. He was pastoring the megachurch. He was driving the car. He had the life. Okay, we all wanted it. Okay, sick as that sounds, we all want it. Even in Reformed Presbyterian circles, there's still a lot of that ambition that wants the big church, wants the life, wants the recognition, blah, blah, blah. It's all there. Regardless of how much they talk about total depravity, it's all there. And this guy stood up and said, "Gentlemen, when you become a pastor, don't ever stand behind the pulpit and confess your own sins, because the people under your care need someone to look up to." And at the time, I bought it. Yeah, man, that sounds right. Worst advice you could give a room full of prospective preachers. You are encouraging a culture of dishonesty by that. You're fueling a culture of pretending with that, which is the opposite of what any form of progressive sanctification is about. That's the irony of it. So when we become proud of the ways we're getting better, it's actually a sign we're getting worse. When we are blind to the ways in which we are prideful, it's actually a sign that we're getting worse. So the progressive sanctificationists don't want to talk too much about progression, or else they might see themselves progressing in the wrong direction.
It's all a brain flip. It's very counterintuitive. But when you experience it, when you see it, when you live it, and quite frankly, when it is coming towards you in a person in this place, it is so liberating. It is so liberating to the individual. I know that that's been my experience. When I came here, when I showed up, climbing out of the rubble of my own experience, and someone said to me, "Hey, aren't you Byron?" Yeah. I was like, "Yeah." Well, yeah, I Googled your name. Welcome. Let's go to lunch. It was like, well, it's a different experience.
A recovery place masquerading as a church.
It is 100% true. Thank you, brother.
Yeah, thanks, man.